Hello, Will Yeoman. Welcome to another episode of Pod Street, Writing WA's official podcast. And today I'm talking to Danielle Linder, who is the author of, amongst many other things, the Red Dragon Trilogy, the most recent book of which in Sea Glass was released, I don't know, Danielle, like a couple of months ago now, it seems.
Yeah, it's probably only a month ago. It's just been a really long month.
Yeah. Well, I remember you and I last spoke when we had a lovely launch event at the State Library of Western Australia in the Theaterette. And
yeah, that was lovely.
Yeah, it was really, really, really great. And I believe you sold a truckload of books as well, which is always a bonus.
I did. Definitely a bonus. I had to order a bunch more because I'm actually going to the Boddington Medieval Fair this weekend.
Oh, wow. That's fantastic.
So I'm going to have an author table down there. I've never been, but it should be fun.
Oh, I'm glad we're talking now then. We can give that a bit of a plug.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll be grateful. Apparently it's been running for a few years and they've had a couple of authors go down and apparently sold a truckload of books. So
that's amazing.
I found it, in fact, on the Writing WA website on the notice board. There's a notice board saying any authors want to come down. So sent them an email.
Oh, that's fantastic. Oh, well, I'll have to, you'll have to let me know how you go.
Yeah, I'll take photos.
Proof, photographic proof.
Yep,
okay.
For Instagram.
Indeed. So let's get back to the trilogy, the Red Dragon Trilogy. Again, as I also said during our last conversation, it was certainly a whole new world for me because I'm not a regular reader of urban fantasy or indeed any kind of fantasy or sci-fi or what will they call it? Speculative fiction,
Genre
I guess
fiction.
That's the embracing form, isn't it?
Fiction.
Yes. So, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I'm saying that because those readers out there who perhaps also don't normally inhabit this genre might want to give it a try because it's extremely entertaining, extremely rich, and actually very funny. So
I'm glad you say that because my partner says that it's funny. He does beta reading for me. And I'm one of those people, I can't be funny on purpose. So everything that's funny in those books is something that I've thought maybe people will like this. And it's turned out to actually be funny, which is fantastic for me.
Well, that's really great because obviously the last thing you want is to not intentionally be funny and then be funny because it's actually bad. So we have to make sure people understand that it's not funny because it's bad. It's funny because it's good.
I have to say, it's really flattering that you, as someone who doesn't tend to read urban fantasy, enjoyed the trilogy that much. That's super nice to hear. It's very complimentary.
Oh, no, thank you. Yeah, and that's why I think it's important to let other readers know that you can have this really enjoyable experience and not be a regular reader of this kind of genre. And speaking of which, let's talk a little bit about the genre for those of our listeners who are perhaps not familiar with it, and then maybe that will lead us into talking about the Red Dragon Trilogy.
All right. So urban fantasy grew out of your regular classic fantasy. Classic fantasy is Lord of the Rings type stuff. Pseudo-medieval world, magic of some sort. Often you've got elves and dwarves and dragons and other fantasy creatures. And then a few writers started setting their fantasy stories closer to home, closer to our own time and our own world. Charles de Lint is one of the major ones, who was an early urban fantasy writer and is quite a heavy influence on my writing.
Okay.
And so urban fantasy is a fantasy story in that there's magic involved in the story, but it's set in this world, sometimes historical. There is urban fantasy that's sort of noir themed, set in the 1920s to 1940s. And there's also urban fantasy that's set now, which is more what I write. All urban fantasy means is that it's the world as it is, plus magic of some sort. So anything from Buffy through to trying to think of a movie that's come out recently that's urban fantasy and completely failing. But
I'm sorry, I can't help you there.
Yeah. Anything, it's called urban fantasy because a lot of it is city-based, because these days a lot of us live in cities, but it just means modern fantasy.
Okay. So would the whole Sookie Stackhouse sort of stuff be like that as well, the True Blood material?
Yeah, yeah, it would. A
Yeah,
lot of the vampire shows and vampire stories that have come out the last few years, even all of the things that get classed as supernatural romance,
right.
also fall under the umbrella of urban fantasy. You know,
Okay.
if it's got werewolves in it, that's still magic.
Okay. Well, I guess a classic example is that American Werewolf in London, isn't it? From quite some years
Oh,
ago now,
absolutely.
very much set
Yeah.
in our own world.
Yep.
Mm.
100%. And urban fantasy is interesting because having that bit of magic in it sets it just that half step away from the world that we're used to and lets us look at things that sometimes are otherwise invisible. People
Mm.
often use fantasy to explore themes of racism, of classism, of coming of age and growing up in an environment where you are different from other people. And let's be honest, every teenager feels like they're different from everybody else. So that feeling of alienation is easy to capture when you've got magic to make you genuinely different from anybody else.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I guess that particular aspect is one that you explored in the Red Dragon trilogy.
Yeah, it was definitely something that I was exploring. Growing up as a nerd, you definitely feel that alienation. And I wasn't even the cool kind of nerd who was into computer games. I just read a lot. So it's, I think every author puts a bit of themselves into their characters. You try not to do it too much so that the characters don't end up all the same. But there's definitely an element of that growing into who you can be and figuring out who you can be through that story.
Mm. Yeah, and the other thing I enjoyed about the trilogy is that it's definitely a journey for Robin, the main character, but it's also a journey for so many other characters, not just her friends, but her frenemies, I guess you could call them, who through the course of the trilogy do sort of really almost do a 90-degree turn, don't they?
They do. I've always thought that, you know, the mustache twirling villains who just are evil for the sake of being evil, the Bond
Mm,
villains, are kind of boring. You know, people aren't actually like that. Barring the occasional psychopath, most people do bad things because they think that they're doing good things or they think
mm,
they're right. And
yes.
sometimes they're wrong. But if they work out that they're wrong, surely they have the opportunity to grow just like the heroes do. And I find that to be a much more interesting story. Often the villains are people who've been traumatized and they're doing bad things because they feel defensive or they have some other reason that to them is a really good reason for doing something that objectively is not a good thing.
Mm,
And I think those are interesting stories to explore as well. You know, one of the characters, the vampire, he was not meant to be a major character. He was meant to be a throwaway minion. And he just kept coming back because there were just more things that that character had to say to the point where he's now in the sequel trilogy as well as a major character.
mm. I mean, yeah, as I say, I love that potential. I mean, it feels like every single character has the potential to be something bigger and better as well. And I'm wondering
Mm.
whether I seem to recall you did touch on role playing games in our last conversation, and how that feeds into your writing. That because you talk about that ability to be someone else or to be more than sorry to be yourself, but more of yourself, if that makes sense. And I think
Yeah, yeah,
role playing gives one the opportunity to really explore that.
yeah. I think people who haven't played role playing games, and we're talking about Dungeons and Dragons style role playing, not any of the other variations
Mm,
that one might do in various situations. Um, they don't realize because it's got this reputation for being super nerdy, they don't realize how many skills you use when you role play. Role playing is very much like improv theater. It's like you get a character, either one that you've made or one that someone's given you, and the person running the story says something like, okay, so you're in the town square, a sudden storm comes over, lightning strikes the ground in front of you, and suddenly there are ranks of alien lizard people standing there in the main square of, say, Perth, right in front of you. They haven't noticed you yet. What do you do? And you have to think not just what you would do as yourself, but what your character would do. And I think the example that I had it was a question from one of the audience at the book launch. It's like, if your character is Conan the Barbarian versus if your character is mild-mannered John Smith, the accountant, you have to think what that person would do. Conan the Barbarian probably wouldn't run away and hide, whereas mild-mannered John Smith, the accountant, quite possibly would scream and run away and hide. That's how you build characters.
So are you saying that you might want to act out of character, but you should probably try to take seriously who that character is and what would be most indicative of their behavior in that situation? Like, it wouldn't make sense, as you said, for Conan to run away, and it wouldn't make sense for the accountant to just like basically kill everybody in sight.
Exactly. I think building, and that's part of why my villains end up the way they are.
Yes.
Because to make a character that behaves consistently, they have to have their own motivations and background. They have to have reasons for the things they do. Otherwise, they could do anything. So if they have motivations and background that say, they care about these causes, these people, and they don't care about these other things, they're brave or they're not brave, they're clever or they're not clever, that affects how they behave in a situation. And as an author, you're the storyteller. You put them in the situation and say, what would you do? And then if they behave consistently, you can predict what they would do. And sometimes that's pretty important because the villains need to be predictable to you as the author as well. And then the villains have motivations, and then the villains get a bit sympathetic, and then the villains get their own story.
No, I think you're definitely an equal opportunity employer when it comes to characters.
I try.
So can you tell us a little bit, again, without any spoilers if possible, can you just tell us a bit more about the trilogy and then bring us up to speed with In Sea Glass, which is, as I say, the most recent book?
Okay, so I've been working on my elevator pitch. It's still not perfect. The Red Dragon trilogy follows three cousins, Robin, Taryn, and Jay, who have grown up with their grandmother. Robin's parents are deceased, and Taryn and Jay have living parents, but they all spend a lot of time with their grandmother, who, like many grandmothers, tells fairy stories. And she weaves her history into those stories and tells them about magic. So they grow up half believing in magic, but it's little magics. The kind of thing where you put a horseshoe over the door because it's lucky. Or where you find that if you have some kind of small psychic gift, you can set things on fire by staring at them for a long time. It's not super surprising. And instead of thinking X-Files or X-Men, you think, oh, Gran was right about some of it.
Yeah.
So that's where they start. They don't believe in magic, enchantments and sorcerers and flashbang, but they believe in little magics. The spirit in the garden who helps the garden grow and keeps the rats out. And then they run into some big magics, dangerous big magics and magical things that are interested in them for reasons that they don't understand. And having the Fae be interested in you is dangerous. As Terry Pratchett said, if elves were not as pretty as they are, we'd realize that they are like cats. They're quite mean. I'm not quoting exactly, but Lords and Ladies had a lot to say about elves.
Yes.
And the elves in my world are not as cruel as that, but they're not nice. They're immortal creatures. They don't think of people necessarily as being people. If you're interesting, it's like if a stray cat was interesting. They might follow you around, they might adopt you, and whether you want to be adopted might not make much difference to them. So Robin, Taryn, and Jay run into fairy creatures, and then the world gets progressively stranger as these fairy creatures become more and more interested in them. and they try to figure out the reason why. Jay and one of their friends ends up being kidnapped by mysterious beings who are related to the Fae. And most of the rest of the first book is Taryn and Robin trying to work out how to find and rescue their friends. And along the way, discovering that there is a magical supervillain who may or may not be trying to end the world, or might just be trying to murder a bunch of people. And trying to stop that from happening in their backyard, where their backyard is Perth, definitely. I believe I located that house somewhere around sort of East Vic Park, sort of Kensington area. When I was in my teens, a friend of mine lived in a big old house in Kensington, and it was scheduled for demolition, so the owners didn't really care what he did. And we used to have quite a lot of parties in that house, some of them a little bit wild. That's the house that I was thinking of.
Wow.
The house in my story is quite a lot bigger, but it's got that same slightly derelict feel to it. And then as we get to book 2 and then In Sea Glass, which is book 3 of that trilogy, we discover that Jay is a self-rescuing princess and has managed to get herself out of trouble before her rescuers found her. But the rescuers don't know where she is, and they don't know if she's in more trouble or if she's fine. So they're looking for her. And they get a bit lost along the way. There is another story about Taryn and what he does during that period. But Robin looks away from the path for a moment, which for anyone who's read fairy tales, that's a dangerous thing to do. You lose track of people, and then you take another path and you could end up anywhere. And she does. And we then have her traveling through the other world, trying to find her way out, which is, again, as per fairy tales, a lot more difficult than finding your way in.
Absolutely.
In the Sea Glass, she follows that path into an underwater kingdom, thus the reference to Sea Glass. And she does end up finding a way out, and then has to decide if she's going to leave or if she's going to carry on trying to make everything better. And during this whole period, she's discovering that that little bit of magic that she's always had is actually a lot more powerful than she thought if she learns to use it right. And to learn to use it right, she needs a teacher, which is problematic given the potential people who could teach her to use her magic. I think that's a much longer summary than I was trying for.
No, it's good though, because you've managed to do it without giving away too much, which I like. It's what was I going to say? This idea, going back to the whole idea of urban fantasy and the idea that you had this specific house in Kensington in mind, and also this idea that you start with such subtle magic, I guess, or rather innocuous. All of that does help the reader to enter this world and to feel like it's actually quite normal and natural. So it almost feels like you've got them from the beginning, and then you gradually bring them along, and before they know it, they're in this quite insane world, to be honest.
That was the idea. I moved to Perth when I was 12 from South Africa.
Okay.
And I lived in Johannesburg, which is a big city in the middle of the country, and it's dirty and polluted. And then I moved to Perth, which is this gorgeous, glorious seaside town. So to me, as a 12-year-old, Perth and Western Australia as a whole have always been magical. I got here and everything was so different and so beautiful. Like, people who live here have got no idea how lucky they are. It's just gorgeous. And you go just this little bit out of town, even as far as we are here in Chittering, and it's just trees and forests and wild birds everywhere. It's glorious. And I wanted to capture some of that wonder that I felt as a child and have continued to feel as an adult for this landscape and this space. and give that to people in the form of that magical realism. You know, if you call it spirits and magic, it lets people look with new eyes at things that are genuinely magical, even though, you know, we see them every day.
That's such a great point, and to say that it's probably easier for outsiders to remain in awe of their new home than it is for those of us who may have grown up here or indeed were born here and take it for granted somewhat. So you're right, and that's a great job that fiction should be doing anyway, isn't it? To making us see the world afresh and new, and to keep that sense of wonder. But you talk about Chittering, and I did want to get to that because it's such a great part of the state, isn't it? It's not too far from Perth, and yet, as you say,
gorgeous.
once you're there, it's just like you're in the middle of this beautiful countryside with rolling hills and valleys and greenery and all sorts of things. How did you guys end up actually being able to live there? That's amazing.
My partner and I actually looked at a map and we drew a circle around the center of the city of Perth.
Yes.
That was the longest area that we thought was plausible to commute to and from work.
Right.
And which was probably it was just under 100 Ks from the center of Perth.
Yep.
We're like, that can be done. It may or may not be great, but we'll see what we can do. And then we looked at properties that were for sale and we drove around. At the time, he had a motorbike. So we hopped on the motorbike and went for a couple of long drives and had a look. Because I've always wanted to have, you know, at least an acre where I could put some fruit trees up, maybe have a couple of chickens. I like animals and plants. I'm a gardener in my spare time. And we looked at a bunch of different properties and did all the good things. We looked at the soil and the fire risk and the slope of the land and water availability. And we came to this property and it was a little bit further out than we'd ideally wanted, but it was just really pretty. And like rural properties, at the time, there was no house on it or anything. When they're for sale, they just leave the gate open. You wander up, you walk around. Unless somebody's got animals on it, you can just go onto the property and have a look. So we wandered on and we had a look and we kind of fell in love with it. And we went away, we looked at a few others and we kept coming back to this one. So we put an offer on it and ended up buying the property. For the first couple of years, we used to come up every weekend and camp. So we'd bring a tent and camp on the block. Enjoy the stars.
Wow.
And then we put up a garage and then the camping became easier because we just used to bring up a futon mattress, roll it out in the garage. And then once we could afford it and decided that we were ready, we built a house.
Wow.
Before all the building companies went out of business and it was so hard. And we moved up here about 9 years ago now. And it's really great. The kangaroos eat the fruit trees, which is annoying. Like everybody who thinks kangaroos are cute has never tried to actually live in a place where kangaroos are also living. They do not eat the things that are normal food for native animals. We've got half the block as bush. So it's regrowth bush with carry trees and grass trees and wildflowers. It's gorgeous. The kangaroos don't eat any of the things in there. Instead, they come and nip the tips off of my fruit trees.
Very naughty.
It's like, it's literally poison for them.
Yeah.
Fruit tree leaves are not edible.
Yes.
But no, they're curious.
It's like they make a line directly to what they shouldn't be eating. It sounds very mischievous to me, which is not unlike some of the characters in your books. I mean, I'm guessing. I'm guessing too, when you do have, when you're not working away from there and you've got time to spend in your property, on your property, it must be a great place to write. It must be so quiet and free from distraction.
It's really nice. I do sometimes go and write in cafes just to have people around and people watch. Sure. But it is really nice writing up here because it is quiet and, at night there's very little light pollution, even though we're now a 45-minute drive from the center of Perth.
It's amazing.
So it's not actually as far as it feels. but you look up and you can see the stars. You can see the Milky Way well enough to see the dark patches in it. Like, the Aboriginal constellations where it's the dark patches among the stars, the gas patches, which closer into town, you can't see that.
No, you're absolutely right. It's just the lights of the city, even a city as small as Perth, just tend to drown it all out, don't they? Sort of maybe as a last question, what are you working on now? What's next for you?
Next project. Okay, so for context, I recently published a campaign setting for role-playing games. It's called Yath, and it's a steampunk kind of gas lamp fantasy world. So that came out in January, and I've got several pre-made adventure scenarios. So it's like a choose your own adventure. Somebody can pick up one of these things and just run that story, get a bunch of people to play.
Yes.
I've got 4 of those that are mostly written and just need a bit of polishing, a bit of artwork added. I'm aiming to get those out over the next sort of year and a half. I've got the next novel that fits in with the Red Dragon and Black Dragon trilogies. It's a standalone novel that sits in between the 2 trilogies, which is written and just needs a final edit. So I'm hoping to bring that out maybe in June or July this year.
Okay.
So got to finish the editing for that. I have another novel which is written and needs editing. So it's going to be one of the 2 of them in June and the other one hopefully in January or February next year. I've just started up a mailing list, which I've got a novel that I'm serializing on the mailing list. So that's going to start going out mid-April with a chapter every 2 weeks.
Wow.
So I'm trying to make sure that I've got the first few chapters finished and polished enough that I'm prepared for people to read them. I've just published a role-playing game for a game jam, which it literally went live on the 1st of April, called Crown of the Crocodile God, which it's a little heist set in a medieval town. You get to go and steal something from the sewer nuns. Obviously, you know about the sewer nuns. They're the ones who keep the crocodiles from becoming a problem.
Naturally.
Yeah, naturally. So those are the things that are currently in progress. And I've got the final book of the Black Dragon trilogy to write over the next year and a bunch of marketing to do.
Well, so in other words, you're very, very busy and you've got a lot of projects, not just one.
A lot of projects.
Not one thing
on the go.
So when they say what's next, well, there are a lot of things next. Yes, it's great.
There are a lot of things. I have trouble stopping with projects.
That's not a bad thing, provided you actually do finish them, which you seem to do, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
So where can people find out about all this stuff? And where's the best place for them to buy your books as well?
I have a website, which is just my name. So it's daniellelinder.com. And that is probably the best place. There's a page on that that's got all of my socials, all of my contact details. And you can also buy the books directly through that website. If you want them in print, there's a website called Drive Through Fiction.
Right.
Which, they're on Amazon as well, but Amazon, being the giant conglomerate that it is not as kind to us independent authors as some other places. So I would send people through to Drive Through Fiction if they want print copies of the books.
Lovely.
And there are links to that on my website as well. So if you go to daniellelinder.com, you should be able to find all of the links to all of the things.
It's a one-stop shop.
That was the idea.
No, it's excellent. Well, I have been on it. I was really only asking for the benefit of others because clearly I know exactly where you need to go to get your books from. Look, that's wonderful. Thanks so much for talking to us. It's been great to chat again. Good luck with all your various projects. Good luck with your continued idyllic lifestyle in Chittering, which I'm very envious of. And we look forward to hearing from you again soon, probably when the next book's out. So thanks again.
Yeah, thanks very much, Will. And we will do another book launch in hopefully a couple of months.
Absolutely.